The merchant ship Frontier Dream came out of quantum space 3 hours late, and Captain Dennis Hoffman knew something was wrong immediately. New Haven Colony should have been sending signals, but there was only silence. He told his crew to move forward slowly, and everyone watched their screens with growing fear. New Haven was a good place where 12,000 people lived on a forest world called Kepler 442b. The colony had been there for 23 years, and families had built homes under alien stars. Children were born there and people were happy. It was humanity's pride in the galaxy. What Captain Hoffman found made his blood run cold. The defensive satellites around the planet were destroyed, and their metal shells were torn open by plasma weapons. Below on the surface, the colony was burning. All the buildings were melted into liquid metal and everything was covered in ash. Captain Hoffman ordered Lieutenant Karen Hayes to take the ship down for a closer look, even though his stomach told him what they would find. They landed near what used to be the main settlement and walked through the ruins. The smell of death was everywhere. Bodies lay scattered across the ground by the thousands. Men and women and children and old people. Nobody was spared from the killing. The attack was done carefully and completely without any mercy shown to anyone. Chief Medical Officer Greg Palmer found something that made his hands shake as he recorded what he saw. The colonists were not just killed quickly. They were hunted like animals. Burn marks on buildings showed where people tried to hide from their killers. Small piles of burned cloth and bones showed where parents died trying to protect their children. Nothing they did mattered in the end. Security Officer Linda Shaw found the colony's computer system and parts of it still worked. She pulled up the recordings and they all watched in horror. The recordings showed ships that were sleek and deadly with markings of the Zathran sovereignty. The humans knew about the Zathran because they were a reptile species that controlled 40 star systems in this part of space. Earth had kept distant but peaceful relations with them for 10 years. The recording showed Zathran soldiers walking through the colony and killing people without any emotion. They took their time with the massacre. The whole thing lasted 6 hours, and the Zathran enjoyed every moment of it. Captain Hoffman sent everything back to Earth using the fastest channels with the highest priority codes. Then he made a choice that people would later call either very brave or very stupid. He ordered the Frontier Dream to fly at full speed to the nearest Zathran outpost at Beta Hydri, and he wanted answers from them. The Zathran commander at Beta Hydri was named Vexthor, and he received the human ship with what looked like amusement. Commander Vexthor was a scarred veteran who had conquered many worlds, and he did not try to hide what his people did. Captain Hoffman's face appeared on Vexthor's screen, and the human looked angry. Vexthor spoke through the translation computer, and his voice had no emotion in it. Vexthor said the human colony was built in territory that the Zathran claimed 30 cycles ago. He said humanity was warned to stay in their own star systems. He said the massacre was a lesson about respecting boundaries and knowing your place. Captain Hoffman felt rage building inside him. He said 12,000 civilians died, including children. His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Vexthor said it was irrelevant. He said humans were a young species and must learn their place among the stars. He said the Zathran were being generous by choosing a small colony for this lesson. He said it could have been one of Earth's orbital cities instead. Captain Hoffman cut the transmission before he said something he might regret. His hands were shaking with fury. He looked around at his bridge crew and saw the same cold anger reflected in all their eyes. He ordered his communications officer to contact Earth immediately. He wanted to speak with the Colonial Defense Fleet. He wanted to speak with anyone who would listen to what happened here. The Zathran thought humanity would accept this massacre. They thought humans would be scared and run back to Earth with their tails between their legs like frightened dogs. Captain Hoffman stared at the view screen showing the Zathran station, with its lights twinkling peacefully against the black stars. He said quietly that the Zathran had no idea what they just did to themselves. Back on Earth in the halls of the United Earth Government headquarters in Geneva, the recordings from New Haven played on every screen. Admiral Victor Kane was the commander of Earth's Colonial Defense Fleet, and he watched the recordings 3 times. His weathered face grew harder with each viewing, and something cold settled into his eyes. Secretary General Maria Torres called an emergency meeting of the Planetary Council. Representatives from every nation and every bloc and every faction came together. These were people who spent the last 100 years arguing about resources and jurisdiction and sovereignty, and who had power over what. They watched the footage from New Haven in complete silence. For the first time in human history, every single representative voted the same way on something. The measure passed unanimously in 47 seconds. Nobody needed to discuss it. Nobody needed to debate it. They all knew what had to be done. Admiral Kane received his orders that same night. As he read them, he felt something he had not experienced since his days as a young Marine lieutenant in the last of Earth's wars decades ago. It was not anger. It was not even rage. It was something much colder and much more dangerous. It was purpose. He opened a communication channel that reached every ship and every station and every military installation under Earth's command. Thousands of people heard his voice at the same time. Admiral Kane's voice was steady and cold as ice when he spoke. He said all hands should listen carefully. He said they had new orders from the Planetary Council. He paused for just a moment to let the weight of his next words sink in properly. He said they were going to war. Across human civilization, the message spread like wildfire. On orbital stations and lunar bases and Martian colonies and asteroid mining facilities, people heard the news. The Zathran sovereignty had massacred New Haven colony. 12,000 civilians were dead. Earth's response was unified and absolute. Humanity was done being peaceful. Humanity was done being diplomatic. Humanity was done being civilized. The Zathran wanted to teach humanity a lesson about power and hierarchy and respecting their betters. They were about to learn a very different lesson. They were about to learn what happens when you murder human children and think there will be no consequences. They were about to learn that humanity's preference for peace was a choice and not a weakness. They were about to learn that when you push humanity too far, something wakes up that should have been left sleeping. Admiral Kane stood in his office looking at star charts showing Zathran territory. 40 systems spread across space like a cancer. He thought about New Haven. He thought about the children who died screaming. He thought about the parents who could not protect them. His orders were clear. His purpose was absolute. His resolve was unbreakable. The Zathran sovereignty was going to pay for every single life they took. They were going to pay in blood and fire and steel. They were going to pay until they begged for mercy. And even then, humanity might not be inclined to show them. The war was coming and nothing in the galaxy was going to stop it. The mobilization began within hours of the Planetary Council's vote, and for the first time since humanity reached the stars, the entire species moved with one single purpose. There was no debate about whether to respond because everyone agreed the only question was how hard to hit back. Admiral Kane set up his command center on the ECS Indomitable, which was Earth's largest carrier. Currently floating in high orbit above the moon, his staff worked in shifts around the clock and they were assembling a response that would make the Zathran regret ever hearing the word human. Colonel Jack Morrison commanded the 5th Marine Expeditionary Force, and he arrived on the Indomitable within 36 hours of the recall order. His unit had been doing training exercises on Mars, but they dropped everything and came ready for war. He stood in front of Admiral Kane with perfect military posture despite the exhaustion showing in his face. Colonel Morrison reported that the 5th Marine Expeditionary Force was at full readiness with 15,000 Marines and full combat equipment and orbital drop capability. He asked where Admiral Kane needed them deployed. Admiral Kane's answer was simple and direct. He said everywhere. But first they needed to send a message that even the Zathran could not misunderstand or ignore. The Admiral's plan was bold and risky. The Colonial Defense Fleet's ships were powerful, but they had been designed mainly for exploration and defense. They could fight when needed, but they were not built from the ground up as pure warships. Admiral Kane intended to change that fact immediately. He sent orders to every shipyard in the solar system, the massive construction facilities on the moon and the industrial complexes in Mars orbit and the asteroid mining operations in the belt, and even the atmospheric processors at Jupiter's moons all received the same priority requisition: build warships and build them fast. Dr. Helen Cruz was the chief designer at Luna Dynamics, and she received specifications that made her catch her breath in surprise. The plans called for something humanity had no built before, which was a Dreadnought-class warship designed for one purpose only: not exploration, not defense, pure offense and destruction. Dr. Cruz muttered to her lead engineer, Pete Sanders, that this was a ship built to break planets. She said the reactor output alone would power a small city on Earth. Pete Sanders looked at the plans and said then they better get started. He pointed out that the order said they wanted 12 of these dreadnoughts built in 6 months. Dr. Cruz said that was impossible. Nobody could build ships that large and complex that, quickly, Pete Sanders reminded her that building Luna City in 5 years was also supposed to be impossible. But they did it anyway. Dr. Cruz looked at the specifications, again, and studied the weapons arrays and armor plating and engine assemblies that represented humanity's transformation from peaceful explorer to hardened warrior. She thought about the footage from New Haven. She thought about the children who died screaming in fear. She told Pete Sanders they would have the dreadnoughts ready in 4 months instead of 6. Across human-controlled space, the machinery of war spun up to a pace that stunned the few alien observers who bothered to notice. Weapons factories that had been producing mining equipment retooled their assembly lines overnight. Agricultural stations diverted precious resources to manufacture military rations. Scientists who had been studying exoplanet atmospheres suddenly found themselves designing better targeting systems for long-range missiles. In the asteroid belt, Commander Paul Drake oversaw the transformation of mining facilities into weapons platforms. The same systems that had been extracting precious metals from rocky asteroids were now being repurposed to hollow them out and fill them with engines and weapons and turn them into kinetic kill vehicles. Commander Drake's second-in-command was Lieutenant Amy Foster, and she observed that they were literally turning asteroids into bullets. Commander Drake agreed, but said they were very big bullets. He said these asteroids would be moving at a significant percentage of light speed. He wanted to see if the Zathran's fancy shields could handle a few 100,000 tons of iron and nickel alloy hitting them at .05 the speed of light. The training became more intense across all branches of the military. Marines who had spent their whole careers preparing for possible pirate actions or colony defense scenarios suddenly found themselves drilling for ship-to-ship boarding actions and full-scale planetary assault operations. Pilots who were accustomed to flying cargo runs now practiced attack formations every single day. Engineers learned how to repair combat damage while under enemy fire. General Lisa Park was the commandant of the Marine Corps, and she addressed her assembled officers in a secure briefing room on Earth. The room held 200 of the Corps' best leaders who were men and women that had volunteered to put their lives between humanity and any threat that emerged. General Park wanted to be very clear about what they were facing. She said the Zathran sovereignty controlled 40 star systems. She said they had a standing military force that outnumbered humanity's forces 20-1. She said their ships were battle-tested from centuries of conquest campaigns. She said that on paper humanity should not be able to win this war. She paused and let that information sink into everyone's minds. But then she said humanity had something the Zathran did not have. She said they were not fighting for territory or resources or glory or pride. She said they were fighting because the Zathran murdered human children and thought humanity would just accept it quietly. She said the Zathran think humans are soft because humans prefer diplomacy over violence. She said the Zathran think humans are weak because humans choose civilization over barbarism. General Park's eyes swept across the room and locked onto each officer present. She told them to show the Zathran what happens when humanity stops being civilized. The intelligence picture began filling in as Earth's small but effective spy network fed information back to Fleet Command. The Zathran sovereignty had indeed claimed the sector where New Haven was located, but they had done so in a filing with the Galactic Council that humanity was never informed about. It was a technicality at best and a flimsy excuse at worst. More importantly, the intelligence revealed that the attack on New Haven had been ordered directly from the sovereignty's high command as what they called a proactive boundary enforcement action. It was not a rogue commander making a bad decision. It was not a tragic misunderstanding between species. It was deliberate policy approved at the highest levels. Commander Ruth Allen was the chief of fleet intelligence, and she delivered her assessment to Admiral Kane in his private ready room aboard the Indomitable. She told the Admiral that the Zathran had done this before to other species. She said there were 7 other species, all relatively new to the galactic stage, who had been targeted the same way. She explained that the Zathran establish claims on border territories and then wait for someone to accidentally colonize there and then use it as justification for a punitive strike. She said it worked every single time. The victim species either backed down completely or got slowly absorbed into the sovereignty through a series of small defeats. Admiral Kane asked how many casualties occurred in the previous incidents. Commander Allen checked her datapad and said the lowest was 400 dead and the highest was 32,000 dead. She said the attack on New Haven with 12,000 casualties fell right in the middle of their typical range. Admiral Kane was quiet for a long moment while he studied the star charts displayed on his wall. The Zathran sovereignty sprawled across a significant portion of local space with 40 systems connected by established jump routes. Finally, Admiral Kane spoke and said the Zathran were bullies. He said they had been doing this for so long that it became standard operating procedure for them. He said they see a new species and they push hard, and when that species pushes back weakly or not at all, the Zathran push even harder until the victim gives up. He said it was a pattern of behavior. Commander Allen agreed. Admiral Kane said then humanity was going to break that pattern completely. He said they were not going to push back. He said they were going to hit the Zathran so hard that they would never even think about raising a hand to another human being ever again. He turned to Commander Allen and said he needed target packages prepared. Not just military installations, but also infrastructure and shipyards and resource extraction facilities and command and control centers. He said he wanted options that would cripple the Zathran ability to wage war. Commander Allen pointed out that some of those targets would be located in civilian areas. Admiral Kane said then they would be extremely precise in their strikes. He said humanity was not going to massacre civilians because humans were not like the Zathran, but he said humanity was absolutely going to make it crystal clear that there was a cost to attacking human beings. He said that cost would be so high the Zathran would never consider paying it again. After Commander Allen left to prepare the target analysis, Admiral Kane returned to studying the star charts. Red icons marked known Zathran military installations scattered across their territory. Blue icons showed human colonies, which was Earth's small but growing network of settlements among the near stars. New Haven's icon blinked in memorial status. It showed both red and blue colors mixed together. Admiral Kane spoke softly to the display as if the dead could hear him. He said they were coming for justice. He said God help anyone who tried to stand in humanity's way. The ECS Indomitable led a fleet of 32 ships through the quantum slip point, and they emerged in the Zathran system of Krixvar exactly on schedule. The system was a major logistics hub for the sovereignty, with 3 orbital shipyards and a planetary defense station that coordinated Zathran military movements across 6 sectors. It was also 215 light-years from Earth, which meant it was deep inside territory the Zathran considered absolutely secure and safe from any attack. Admiral Kane gave the order, and his voice was calm and steady. He said all ships go to battle stations and execute Alpha Strike on his mark. The human fleet spread into attack formation with practiced precision, and the weeks of intensive training showed in every movement and every maneuver. These were not explorers playing at being soldiers. They were warriors who happened to use starships instead of rifles. The Zathran defenders reacted with confusion at first, and then growing alarm. 6 patrol ships moved to intercept the human fleet, and their weapons began charging up. The defense station's massive plasma cannons started calculating firing solutions and tracking the incoming human vessels. They were still calculating when the first human missiles arrived and hit their targets. Commander Steve Hayes was the weapons officer aboard the Indomitable, and he watched his displays with grim satisfaction. He reported missiles away and said time to target was 45 seconds. The missiles were a completely new design that had been rushed into production over the past 3 months. Each one carried a fusion warhead, scaled up from Earth's old nuclear arsenal but wrapped in modern materials and guidance systems that made them frighteningly effective at their job. The Zathran point defense systems managed to intercept 60% of the incoming missiles, which was actually quite impressive. The remaining 40% was more than enough to do the job. The first shipyard exploded in a sphere of brilliant white light, and its structure shredded into component atoms. The second shipyard's defensive shields overloaded completely and allowed 3 missiles through to detonate directly against its central hub. It broke apart slowly with massive sections tumbling. Away in the eerie silence of space, Admiral Kane ordered all ships to target the defense station next, and he wanted concentrated fire from all heavy ships at the human fleets. Capital ships led by the battlecruiser ECS Defiant, under Captain Nicole Grant, opened up with their main railguns. Solid metal slugs accelerated to incredible velocities crossed the distance to the defense station in just seconds. The station's shields held strong for exactly 4 volleys before they collapsed completely. The 5th volley tore through the station's hull like it was paper and secondary. Explosions rippled across its surface as atmosphere and fuel ignited in brilliant flashes. Zathran patrol ships tried to mount some kind of defense, but they were designed for showing the flag and intimidating smaller species, not for serious combat against a determined enemy. The human destroyers were smaller than the patrol ships, but much more maneuverable, and they tore into the Zathran vessels with a devastating combination of missiles and energy weapons. Lieutenant Kevin Shaw was piloting his strike fighter from the Indomitable's launch bay, and he led a squadron of 12 fighters against one of the patrol ships. He told his squadron to target the enemy's engine section because he wanted to make sure they could not run away. The fighters swept in fast, and their cannons stitched lines of fire across the Zathran ship's aft section. The patrol ship tried to track them with its weapons, but the guns were too slow because they were designed for long-range engagement rather than close-quarters dogfighting. Lieutenant Shaw's missiles impacted directly on the engine housing, and the patrol ship went completely dark and started tumbling through space without power. Shaw reported Splash 1 and said he was moving to the next target. The entire engagement lasted exactly 11 minutes from start to finish. When it was over, Krixvar's orbital infrastructure was nothing but debris floating in space. 3 shipyards were destroyed completely. 1 defense station was disabled and drifting. 6 patrol ships were either destroyed or floating powerless in the dark. The human fleet had taken minimal damage with just a few shield impacts and 1 destroyer with a damaged sensor array. Admiral Kane surveyed the destruction with no satisfaction and no sense of victory in his heart. This was not about glory or pride. This was about making a point that could not be ignored or misunderstood. He told his communications officer to open a channel to the planet. Below on all frequencies, a moment later, a Zathran face appeared on the main view screen. This one was older, with scales faded by age, and it wore the elaborate sash that marked planetary governance. The Zathran identified itself as Governor Kalseth. It said the humans had attacked a sovereign system without provocation, and this was an act of war. Admiral Kane's response was immediate, and his voice was ice-cold. He said wrong. He said this was a response to an act of war. He said the Zathran attacked humanity's colony at New Haven and murdered 12,000 civilians. He said the Zathran told humanity it was a lesson about respecting boundaries. Governor Kalseth tried to argue and said that colony violated Zathran territorial claims. Admiral Kane cut him off and said, then humanity was here to teach the Zathran a lesson about violating human lives. He said humanity was not asking for territory. He said humanity was not interested in Zathran resources. He said humanity was here to make it crystal clear that every human life the Zathran took would be repaid 1,000-fold. He gestured at the view screen showing the debris field. That had been Krixvar's orbital facilities. Just minutes before, Admiral Kane said this was just the beginning. He said humanity was going to visit every major Zathran military installation in the sovereignty. He said humanity was going to dismantle the Zathran ability to wage war piece by piece. He said humanity would keep doing it until Zathran leaders agreed to terms that would ensure this never happened again to any human, anywhere. Governor Kalseth tried to sound confident, but there was uncertainty in its posture. It said humanity could not sustain such a campaign. It said the Zathran had 40 systems and hundreds of ships. Admiral Kane's response was simple and direct. He said then humanity would destroy them all if necessary. He said the Zathran's choice was very simple. They could negotiate a peace that included reparations and guarantees, or they could watch humanity burn their military infrastructure to the ground system by system. He said what happened at New Haven ended now. He said one way or another it was over. He cut the transmission without waiting for a response. Admiral Kane ordered all ships to prepare to jump to the next target immediately. He said they were not giving the Zathran time to regroup or coordinate a response as the fleet began calculations for the next slip point jump. Commander Allen approached the Admiral with new intelligence updates fresh from their listening posts. She reported they were picking up transmissions across all the Zathran communication networks. She said the Zathran were mobilizing their entire fleet. Admiral Kane said good. He said let them come. He said the more ships the Zathrans sent after the human fleet, the fewer ships they would have to defend their other installations. Commander Allen said there was something else the Admiral needed to know. She said they were detecting encrypted transmissions going out to other species. She said the Zathran were calling in favors and requesting military assistance from their allies. Admiral Kane considered this new information carefully. The possibility of other species joining the fight was something the strategic planners back on Earth had anticipated. The Zathran had allies and friends who were species that had benefited from sovereignty protection or profitable trade agreements over the years. Kane asked how many potential hostiles they were looking at. Commander Allen said it was hard to say for certain. She said the Vakrine Collective had strong economic ties to the Zathran. She said the Rule Dominion had a mutual defense pact with the sovereignty. She said it could be as many as 2 or 3 other species fielding ships against humanity. Admiral Kane said then humanity had better move fast. He ordered Commander Allen to accelerate the operational timetable. He said he wanted to hit 5 more systems in the next 72 hours. He said keep the Zathran off balance and unable to coordinate an effective response. The Indomitable and her fleet vanished into slipspace, leaving Krixvar's orbital space filled with wreckage and debris. The shocked remnants of Zathran governance were left wondering how the species they had, dismissed as soft explorers, had just dismantled their defenses in less time than it took to eat a morning meal. On Earth, the news of the strike sent shockwaves through the entire civilian population. Secretary General Torres addressed the planet in a broadcast that reached every settlement and every station and every human being in occupied space. Torres said that today humanity's colonial defense fleet struck back against those who believed humanity would accept the murder of innocent children. She said this was not a war of conquest. She said this was not a war of revenge. She said this was a war to ensure that no one ever again thought they could attack human beings without facing serious consequences. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of human history. Torres said that for decades humanity prided itself on being civilized, and on choosing diplomacy over violence, and on building things rather than destroying them. She said humanity still valued all those things deeply, but she said the Zathran sovereignty made the fatal mistake of confusing civilization with weakness. Secretary General Torres looked directly into the camera with hard eyes. She said the Zathran wanted to teach humanity a lesson. She said consider it learned. She said now humanity was going to teach the Zathran a lesson in return. She said humanity protects its own. She said always. She said no matter what it costs. 3 weeks into the campaign, Admiral Kane's fleet had struck 9 Zathran systems, and the pattern was always exactly the same. They would arrive without any warning and destroy military infrastructure with overwhelming force and deliver the same message about consequences and terms and then jump away. Before the Zathran could mount any kind of effective response, the sovereignty's military was in complete chaos now. Ships that had been spread across 40 systems rushed to consolidate into larger battle groups, and they tried desperately to predict where the humans would strike next. Every single guess was wrong. Admiral Kane's intelligence network had been expanded and refined with each engagement, and it kept humanity one step ahead of every Zathran move. But the campaign was beginning to show real strain on the human forces. The fleet needed resupply and repairs and rest. Crews that had been running on pure adrenaline and determination for weeks were exhausted. Admiral Kane knew deep down they could not maintain this brutal pace indefinitely. Commander Allen reported during a strategy session in the Indomitable's briefing room that they were getting signals intelligence suggesting the Galactic Council was preparing to intervene in the conflict. The Galactic Council was something like a galactic version of the United Nations. It was a loose confederation of spacefaring species that maintained common trade standards and mediated disputes between members. Humanity had observer status but was not a full member because humans had only achieved faster than light travel. 25 years earlier, Admiral Kane asked what kind of intervention the Council was planning. Commander Allen said they were calling for an immediate ceasefire and formal negotiations. She said the Zathran had filed a formal complaint claiming humanity was conducting a war of aggression in violation of Council protocols and established law. Captain Grant was present for the briefing, and she let out a harsh, bitter laugh. She said that was incredibly rich. She said the Zathran massacre an entire human colony, and then they have the nerve to claim humanity was the aggressor. Commander Allen explained that the Council operated strictly on precedent and established procedures. She said the precedent was that territorial disputes should be resolved through mediation and diplomatic channels, not military action. She said the Zathran were framing New Haven as a territorial dispute, that humanity had escalated into a full-scale war. Admiral Kane studied the star charts on the briefing room wall. Red markers showed Zathran military installations that the human fleet had already destroyed. Blue markers showed targets they had not hit yet. There were still more blue markers than red ones on the display. Kane asked what the Council's enforcement capability actually was. Commander, Allen pulled up data on her tablet and said it was variable depending on the situation. She said most Council species maintained only token peacekeeping forces, but she said there were 3 or 4 species with significant military capabilities who took Council authority very seriously. She said the Drevix Assembly in particular had a fleet that rivaled the Zathran in total size. Admiral Kane asked the critical question, which was whether they would actually fight to enforce a ceasefire. Commander Allen said unknown. She said the Council had never had to enforce a ceasefire against a species engaged in what they considered legitimate defensive action. She said this situation would be completely unprecedented. Admiral Kane made his decision quickly and firmly. He said continue operations as planned. He said they would hit 3 more systems and then humanity would agree to negotiate, but he said they would negotiate from a position of clear strength, not from weakness. He said he wanted the Zathran sitting across the negotiation table, knowing full well that humanity could and absolutely would resume military operations if the terms were not acceptable. The next target was Frex Prime, which was home to the Zathran fleet, academy and a major staging ground for sovereignty military operations. It was also the most heavily defended target Admiral Kane had selected so far, with permanent battle stations and a garrison fleet of 20 combat ships. Captain Grant observed as the human fleet approached the slip point that this was going to be very different from the previous engagements. She said the Zathran would be ready and waiting for them this time. Admiral Kane agreed and said then humanity had better be ready for them too. The fleet that emerged in Vrex Prime was much larger than any previous strike force. Admiral Kane had recalled additional ships from patrol duties and assembled 45 vessels, including 3 of the new dreadnoughts that had been rushed through construction in record time. The dreadnought ECS Relentless, under Captain Chris Murphy, was an absolute monster of a ship. It was 3 times the size of the Indomitable and bristling with railguns and missile tubes and protected by shields that could shrug off anything short of a direct hit from another battleship's main guns. Admiral Kane gave the order as the fleet accelerated toward the Zathran defenders. He said all ships engage on his mark. The battle that followed was the fiercest and most intense of the entire campaign. The Zathran garrison fleet did not wait to be picked apart from long range. They charged forward with weapons blazing and attempted to close to point-blank range, where their superior numbers might actually matter in the fight. It did not work the way they hoped. The human fleet's coordination had been honed over weeks of continuous combat operations, and it was superior in every way. Ships moved in perfect synchronization and concentrated their fire to overwhelm individual targets before smoothly shifting to the next one. The dreadnoughts anchored the entire formation, and their massive guns methodically destroyed Zathran ships with clinical precision. Lieutenant Shaw was now leading an expanded fighter wing, and he found himself in the thick of the most intense fighting. His squadron engaged Zathran fighters that were faster, but far less durable than the human craft. Shaw ordered his pilots to stay in pairs and not chase individual enemies. He said make the Zathran come to them instead. The tactic worked perfectly. Zathran fighters that broke formation to pursue individual human craft suddenly found themselves caught in devastating crossfire from wingmen. The human losses were minimal. The Zathran losses were absolutely catastrophic. Aboard the Relentless, Captain Murphy directed his ship's fire with the precision of a skilled surgeon. He ordered his weapons officer to target the Zathran flagship with a full broadside. He said, let's cut the head off their command structure. The dreadnought's guns spoke as one unified voice. 20 railgun slugs crossed the distance to the Zathran flagship in less than 1 second. The flagship's shields collapsed completely under the massive onslaught. The follow-up salvo tore through the ship's midsection and broke it cleanly in 2 pieces. The Zathran defense collapsed. Immediately after that, 30 minutes after the Engagement began, Rex Primes. Orbital space was completely clear of hostile ships. The battle stations were silent with their crews either evacuated or dead. The Fleet Academy's orbital facilities were burning and venting atmosphere into space. Admiral Kane surveyed the destruction with absolutely no sense of victory or triumph. This was necessary. This was justice for New Haven. But there was no glory in any of it. He ordered communications to open a channel to the surface. A response came from a Zathran admiral, and its scales were marked with numerous battle decorations. It identified itself as Admiral Zethnor, who was the commander of Rex Prime Defense. It said the humans had won this engagement and asked what terms humanity demanded. Admiral Kane said the same terms humanity had been stating for 3 weeks. He said peace negotiations and reparations for New Haven, and guarantees that no human colony would ever be attacked again. He said humanity wanted a formal acknowledgement from the Zathran High Command that what happened at New Haven was an unprovoked act of war that the Zathran initiated. Admiral Zethnor said the High Command would never agree to such harsh terms. It said the Zathran do not submit to younger species. Admiral Kane said then humanity would keep destroying Zathran military assets until they had no choice but to submit. He said every system the human fleet hit weakened the sovereignty. He said every ship humanity destroyed was one less ship the Zathran had to defend their territory. He asked how long it would be before other species that the Zathran had bullied over the years decided this was their chance to settle old scores. He asked how long before the sovereignty's 40 systems started breaking away because they realized the central government could not protect them anymore. He let that sink in for a moment. Admiral Kane said the Zathran thought they could teach humanity a lesson about power and hierarchy and respecting their betters. He said, but the Zathran made a fundamental error in their thinking. He said they assumed that because humanity preferred peace, that humans were incapable of making war. He said the Zathran confused patience with weakness. He said now the Zathran were learning the difference the hard way. Admiral Zethnor was silent for a long, uncomfortable moment. Finally, it said it would forward Kane's message to the High Command. But it said it could not promise they would listen or agree. Admiral Kane said, make them listen. He said because the alternative was that humanity did not stop. He said the human fleet would hit every single military installation the Zathran had. He said humanity would turn the vaunted sovereignty into a hollow shell. He said when humanity was done, the Zathran would negotiate on whatever terms humanity dictated, or they would have nothing left to negotiate with. The transmission ended abruptly as the human fleet prepared to jump to the next target. Commander Allen received a priority message directly from Earth. She brought it immediately to Admiral Kane. She said the Galactic Council had issued a formal ceasefire order. She said they were demanding both sides stand down immediately and submit to Council mediation. Admiral Kane asked what the Zathran response was. Commander Allen said they had agreed to the ceasefire. She said they were claiming they wanted peace and they were portraying humanity as the aggressors who refused to negotiate reasonably. Admiral Kane felt anger flash through him, but he pushed it down and controlled it. This was politics, and the game the Zathran knew how to play well. They were trying to get the Council to do what their military could not do, which was stop the human advance. The negotiations took place on Sanctuary Station, which was a neutral facility maintained by the Galactic Council in a system claimed by no one. The station orbited a brown dwarf star, and its lights were the only brightness in an otherwise empty and dark void. Admiral Kane led the human delegation, and he was accompanied by Secretary General Torres, who had made the long journey from Earth specifically for these talks. The symbolism was important because it showed humanity's top military and civilian leaders presenting a completely united front. The Zathran delegation was led by High Chancellor Vraxith, who was the supreme leader of the entire sovereignty. It was the first time in living memory that a High Chancellor had personally attended negotiations with another species. That fact alone spoke volumes about how seriously the Zathran were taking this situation. The negotiations began in a massive conference chamber with representatives from a dozen council species serving as observers and mediators. The room was designed to be neutral with environmental controls adjusted to suit multiple species. Humans found it slightly too warm. The Zathran found it slightly too cold. The discomfort was shared equally by both sides. High Chancellor Vraxith opened with what appeared to be a carefully prepared statement. He said the Zathran sovereignty acknowledged that the incident at New Haven was regrettable. He said they were prepared to discuss reasonable compensation for the loss of life within the bounds of established council precedent for border disputes. Secretary General Torres did not rise to the bait. She had reviewed every single word of humanity's position with Admiral Kane and her advisors. They knew exactly what they wanted and they were not going to compromise. Torres said they needed to be very clear about what actually happened. She said Zathran forces did not stumble upon the human colony by accident. She said the Zathran deliberately targeted a civilian settlement. She said they spent 6 hours systematically murdering 12,000 men and women and children. She said then the Zathran told humanity it was a lesson about respecting boundaries. She pulled up a holographic display that showed the final moments recorded from New Haven. The council observers watched in complete silence as Zathran troops executed civilians who were desperately trying to surrender. Torres continued and said this was not a border dispute. She said this was a massacre. She said it was an act of terror designed to intimidate humanity into abandoning their colonies and retreating back to their home system. She said it was in every legal and moral sense an unprovoked act of war. High Chancellor Vraxith shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Around the room, the council observers were silent, and many of them were clearly disturbed by the footage they had just witnessed. Secretary General Torres said humanity responded to that act of war with precision military strikes against Zathran military infrastructure. She said humanity avoided civilian casualties deliberately. She said humanity provided warnings before every attack. She said humanity operated under the rules of war that civilized species were supposed to follow. She turned to face Vraxith directly. Torres said, but make no mistake about humanity's resolve. She said humans were prepared to continue those military operations indefinitely, if that was what it took. She said Admiral Kane's fleet had struck 12 systems. She said the Zathran had 28 more systems with significant military installations. She said humanity could reach all of them. She said humanity would reach all of them unless they received 3 specific things. Torres held up 3 fingers. She said first humanity wanted a formal acknowledgement from the sovereignty that New Haven was an unprovoked attack on civilians. She said not a border dispute. She said not a misunderstanding. She said an attack pure and simple. She said second humanity wanted full reparations to the families of all the victims. She said not based on council precedent which was designed for accidental casualties. She said based on the actual value of the lives the Zathran took. She said third and most important humanity wanted binding guarantees that no Zathran forces would ever attack another human settlement or colony or ship or citizen again. She said those guarantees needed to be enforced by council enforcement mechanisms with real teeth. She sat down calmly. Torres said those were humanity's terms, and they were not negotiable in any way. She said the only question was whether the Zathran agreed to them now or whether Admiral Kane's fleet continued its operations while they thought about it. The silence in the chamber was absolutely complete. High Chancellor Vraxith looked at his advisors, and then at the council observers, and then finally back at Torres and Kane. When he spoke, his translator rendered his words with what might have been resignation. He said these terms were very harsh. Torres replied immediately and said they were fair. She said harsh would be demanding Zathran territory. She said harsh would be dismantling their government. She said harsh would be doing to one of their worlds what they did to New Haven. She said humanity was not asking for any of that. She said humanity was asking for acknowledgement and compensation, and a guarantee it would not happen again. One of the council observers, who was a representative of the Drevix Assembly, spoke up. The observer said that both sides had legitimate grievances. However, the observer said the evidence presented suggested clearly that the initial aggression was on the part of the sovereignty. The observer said the human response, while severe, appeared to have been limited to military targets in accordance with established warfare protocols. Another observer from the Quellan Confederation added that the council strongly encouraged acceptance of these terms. The observer said the alternative was a continued conflict that served absolutely no one's interests. High Chancellor Vraxith was quiet for a very long moment. Around him, his advisors whispered urgently, but he waved them to silence with a gesture. Finally, he said if the Zathran agreed to these terms, what guarantee Did they have that humanity would not use this as a precedent to make further demands? He asked what stopped humans from deciding they wanted Zathran territory or resources. Admiral Kane spoke for the first time in the negotiations. He said because humanity did not want those things. He said he had spent the last month destroying Zathran military installations. He asked if the High Chancellor knew what humanity had not done. He said humanity had not landed troops. He said humanity had not occupied territory. He said humanity had not claimed a single system. He asked if the High Chancellor knew why. Kane leaned forward. He said because humanity did not want an empire. He said humans did not want to conquer anyone. He said humanity just wanted to be left alone to build their colonies and raise their children in peace. But he said humanity would not tolerate anyone who thought they could attack humans without facing consequences. Kane said the Zathran had caused significant damage to the sovereignty's military capabilities, and that was true. He said humanity would cause more damage if it became necessary. But he said humanity would much rather not. He said humans would rather spend their resources building things than destroying them. He said humans would rather their ships were exploring than fighting. He said humans would rather this war ended today. He paused. Kane said, but it only ended on terms that ensured this never happened again. He said those were Secretary General Torres's terms. He said they were fair. He said they were final. The negotiations continued for 3 more days. The Zathran tried to negotiate softer language and smaller reparations and less binding guarantees. Torres and Kane did not budge even 1 inch. They had the military advantage and they knew it. More importantly, they had the moral high ground, and the Council, observers, knew it. On the 4th day, Chancellor Vraxith signed the agreement. The Treaty of Sanctuary, as it came to be known, included everything humanity had demanded. The Zathran sovereignty formally acknowledged that the attack on New Haven was an unprovoked act of aggression. They agreed to pay reparations totaling over 2 trillion credits distributed to the families of all the victims, and they accepted binding restrictions on their military operations, near human space enforced by Council monitoring stations. But the treaty included one more provision that Admiral Kane had insisted on personally. Every spacefaring species in the galaxy would receive a copy of the treaty, and attached to that treaty would be a simple message. The message said humanity seeks peaceful coexistence with all species. It said humans believe in diplomacy and cooperation and mutual benefit. It said humanity will gladly be your partners and your friends, and your allies. But the message continued and said if you attack human people, or harm human civilians, or think humanity's preference for peace makes them weak, then understand this clearly. It said humanity will stop being civilized. It said humanity will bring every resource and every weapon and every soldier they have to bear against you. It said humanity will not stop until you understand that human lives are not negotiable. The message said choose wisely. It was signed by Secretary General Torres and Admiral Kane. Within 1 week, every major species in the galaxy had received the message. The reactions varied widely. Some expressed outrage at humanity's presumption. Others expressed respect for humanity's resolve. A few expressed fear, but none of them expressed any interest in testing whether humanity meant what it said. On the journey back to Earth, Admiral Kane stood on the observation deck of the Indomitable watching the stars slip past in the quantum drive's strange distortion effect. Commander Allen joined him with 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She asked what he was thinking about. Kane said he was thinking about New Haven and about the people they lost. Allen said they made the Zathran pay for that. Kane agreed but said it did not bring anyone back. He said it did not undo what happened. Allen admitted that was true but said it meant it would not happen again. She said not to humans or to anyone else. Kane sipped his coffee slowly. He said what bothered him was how easy the decision was. He said not the fighting but the decision to fight. He said for most of human history people argued about when violence was justified and when war was necessary. He said philosophers and ethicists wrote entire libraries trying to figure out where the line was. He said, but when the Zathran killed human children, humanity did not need philosophers. He said humans did not need debates. He said everyone knew exactly where the line was. He said the Zathran crossed it. He said humanity responded. He said it was that simple. Commander Allen suggested maybe that was the real lesson. She said not that humanity was peaceful or violent, but that humans were capable of both. She said humans choose peace when they can, but they do not hesitate when they cannot. Kane considered that carefully. He said the Zathran thought they understood humanity. He said they looked at human art and philosophy and emphasis on diplomacy and they saw weakness. He said they did not understand that all of that came from strength. He said humanity chose civilization because humans were capable of its opposite. Alan said now the Zathran knew. Kane corrected her and said now they all knew. He said that message was going to reach every species in the galaxy. He said some of them would hate humanity for it. He said some would respect humanity. He said some would fear humanity. Alan asked which reaction. Kane hoped for. Kane looked out at the stars, and at the vast universe humanity was still learning to navigate. He said he hoped they chose to be humanity's friends. He said, but if they could not do that, then he hoped they had the wisdom to leave humans alone. He finished his coffee. Kane said because next time someone crossed the line, humanity might not be as restrained.